All right there, everyone. George Soros is warning that the European Union may indeed be on the brink of collapse. That's what we'll be talking about on today's video. First, a huge shout out to all of our brand new viewers. If this is your first time here, I post 2 videos a day analyzing current events in light of really awesome conservative trends. So if you would, please smack that bell and subscribe button. It'd be an absolute privilege to have you as a regular part of this channel. All right, so the ultra-liberal globalist billionaire George Soros has voiced his concern that the European Union is in the midst of what he's calling an existential crisis and is at genuine risk of collapse. Writing a post for the website Project Syndicate, Soros laments that things frankly couldn't be worse for the EU. And these are his words, quote, "For the past decade," this is what he writes, quote, "everything that could go wrong has gone wrong," close quote. Fundamentally for Soros, there's no longer denying the fact that a number of member nations within the EU have basically rejected what he calls the EU's goal of an ever closer union. Now, I actually think he's right, at least in part, in terms of his diagnosis of what's happened. He thinks that after the 2008 financial crisis, Europe basically transformed into 2 different major mega nations, right? One that's a creditor and the other one that's a debtor. Creditors set the conditions that the debtors have to meet and frankly couldn't meet. And this, of course, created a relationship of mutual animosity, all the while destroying any semblance of equality among European member states, which, of course, is the very opposite of the credo upon which the EU was originally based. And so it's no wonder that so many young people regard the EU as an enemy, one that's deprived them of a prosperous and flourishing future, and have instead turned to the nationalist populists right among the debtor nations who've had no scruples in exploiting such economic insecurities. Interestingly, Soros also laid blame at the feet of President Trump. He argued that his withdrawal from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal effectively destroyed NATO, putting additional pressure on an already beleaguered Europe. Now, Business Insider notes that this isn't the first time Soros has made these prognostications. Back in January of last year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Soros told a dinner party that the very survival of our civilization is at stake, and even speculated that we could be seeing an all-out nuclear war. I couldn't help but think of British Prime Minister David Cameron's warning back in 2016 that if Brexit passed, it could in fact trigger World War III of all things. Now, Soros' apocalyptic warnings aside, he's flat out wrong to think that the crisis facing the EU is solely economic in nature. A lot of leftist politicians and media pundits and university profs have done their best to reduce the rise of nationalist populism throughout Europe to mere economic concerns, which of course reflects their more Marxist worldview, creditor, debtor, and all that. But the data is in, and we now have irrefutable evidence that the existential crisis facing the EU is emphatically not reducible to mere economic concerns. The nationalist populist uprisings going on in Europe began long before the 2008 economic crisis, long before it. Populist movements enjoyed their greatest successes in nations that were already experiencing rather strong economic growth long before 2008. So, for example, in Britain, Nigel Farage and his self-proclaimed People's Army first stormed the political stage into the European parliamentary elections back in 2004. And this was after 48 consecutive periods of economic growth, drawing tremendous support from rather affluent conservatives. And in terms of the working class, one study found that before the 2008 economic crisis, working class voters were twice as likely as their middle class counterparts to vote for nationalist populists in Austria, 3 times as likely in Belgium and France, and 4 times as likely in Norway. Or take Brexit as another example. Britain's National Center for Social Research found that over 50% of Britain's population supported leaving the EU, or at least radically altering it, for the last 20 years. This was not an 11th hour decision. People have been unhappy with the EU long before the 2008 financial crisis, long before the 2015 immigration crisis. If anything, those were just straws that broke the proverbial camel's back. Brexit was decades in the making, which of course is a truth that's rather uncomfortable for liberal globalists to hear. Now, having said all that, Soros is not the only one who sees the collapse of the EU as seemingly imminent. A rather prominent British historian by the name of Niall Ferguson sees the EU beginning to crack from both external and internal pressures. So externally, the EU is beginning to be squeezed by the economic power of the United States on the one side and China on the other, and largely because of the incompetence of Brussels, the EU is simply not able to economically compete with these two powers. Internally, the bloc is going through a massive political paradigm shift with the rise of nationalist populist movements that are seizing power in a growing number of European countries, which is shifting the balance of power away from parties that supported the Union and now towards parties that are increasingly skeptical of it. And as far as this historian is concerned, these are conditions comparable to the Holy Roman Empire just before it collapsed. So needless to say, the combination of these external and internal pressures means that in just the next 10 years, there may not even be a European Union. And what Ferguson is getting at here has been corroborated by European affairs experts such as Ian Kearns, who's also saying that the days of the EU may indeed be numbered. And what Kearns and others are basically observing here is that with Italy fully now in the nationalist populist fold with their new government, and with the rise of the nationalist right's popularity through the whole of Western Europe, all it would actually take is another financial crisis, particularly one that takes a direct hit at the euro, the European Union's common currency, for the entire bloc to shatter and fall apart. In other words, the EU is currently in its most weak and vulnerable position since its inception, which is in turn rendering it a sitting duck for any crisis to come along and just basically blow it apart. The EU is that vulnerable right now. So obviously Soros is not alone in his assessment that the EU may indeed be on its last legs. And we've analyzed as well in some of our other videos a number of forecasting models for the future of the EU that unfortunately for the bullies in Brussels are not very promising. There are two models in particular that appear to be most plausible given the current circumstances, and they both signal the eventual demise of the EU. One forecast model, this comes from the United States Intelligence Agency, it's actually called a collapse scenario, which would involve a mass exodus of countries from the EU, all taking place more or less in tandem. So a bunch of Brexits, as it were, all happening relatively around the same time. And the second forecast model is what's known as the tightrope scenario, where the EU does make some necessary reforms, but it's not enough to garner reciprocal economic investment from the European or global private sector. So in other words, the nationalist populist blowback is successful in evoking necessary reforms coming out of Brussels, but those reforms haven't elicited any confidence among investors. And so there's a tightrope that has to be walked between the success of the reforms, but the disappointing economic returns in deficient material conditions. And once people realize that government spending has to make up for private sector shortfalls, the whole project is seen as unsustainable and nations begin to incrementally exit from the bloc. The important point here is that neither one of these two scenarios results in a sustained EU project. And that includes a scenario where the EU even makes necessary reforms. Even if it does, it may be too little too late. And so it does appear that George Soros's nightmare may in fact be coming true. We may in fact be seeing nothing less than the end of the EU in the not so distant future. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe. Click on either our Patreon or PayPal links below and become a supporter of this channel and help us to continue to analyze current events in light of amazing conservative trends so that you could personally and professionally flourish. God bless.